Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Benjamin Leavenworth, and I am the Honorary Consul of Chile in Philadelphia. As some of you may know, today's event is part of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia's Beyond Our Borders Spotlight Chile series, which the Honorary Consulate is proud to serve as a partner. We are also so grateful to our other series co-presenter, the Chilean American Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the sponsors of the Beyond Our Borders series: Tierra Hotels, the Port of Wilmington, Delaware, the Delaware River Stevedores, the Port of Philadelphia, Western Fumigation, the Maritime Exchange for the Delaware River and Bay, and Tasty Fruity International. They've been just terrific partners throughout this series. Now, so far in the series, we've covered Chile's constitutional referendum, when we had the opportunity to hear from two Chilean senators from different political perspectives about this important democratic process for Chile. And by the way, we just had that process, and I hope my good friend Jose might reflect on it. And I'm sure, Alfonso, you'll have some thoughts on it as well. But the votes are in, and the process has officially commenced. So we could not have had this panel at a more timely moment. And then continuing on with our series, a few weeks ago, we heard from experts from Chile's tourism industry about everything that makes Chile a magical and educational place to visit, from the exciting natural landscapes to the bustling city of Santiago, from wine and food to arts and culture. Today, we continue the spotlight on Chile, but we're drawing the lens back a bit to discuss Latin America's economic outlook as the world slowly emerges from the pandemic and the economic challenges of 2020. It gives me great pleasure to welcome two personal longtime friends, Jose de Gregorio and Alfonso Prat-Gay, to this discussion, whom I've gotten to know in my role as a member of the board of directors of the Global Interdependence Center, from which you'll hear a lot more from my dear friend and colleague, Peter. In 2008, as governor of the Central Bank of Chile, Jose de Gregorio came to Philadelphia to deliver remarks at the Federal Reserve Bank, and then in 2011 hosted GIC at the Central Bank in Chile. In 2015, as Minister of the Treasury, Alfonso Prat-Gay hosted us at the Ministry of the Treasury of Argentina at a particular time of great change for Argentina. And if I may remark openly, Alfonso, it was a time of great hope and expectations. And I hope you can also share a little bit about that, because you did pull off a few miracles at that time. I'd also like to thank the Global Interdependence Center's College of Central Bankers for joining us as our event partner and for helping to host this afternoon's discussion. All of us at the Honorary Consulate, the Chilean American Chamber of Commerce, and the World Affairs Council are grateful for their partnership. We're also grateful to our promotional partner, the Global Chamber in Miami. For today's panel introductions and a few brief remarks, I'd like to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Peter Gold, Principal of the Gold Group, Vice Chair of the Global Interdependence Center, and Chair of the College of Central Bankers. Peter, let me hand you the virtual mic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ben, for those introductory remarks. And particularly thank you, Ben, for your leadership on the board of directors of the GIC, in particular on our South American initiatives and our visitations with central banks and outstanding and distinguished individuals like Jose and Alfonso. So I thought for a second, because there may be some on the phone that are not all that familiar with the term interdependence, that I would just a little bit explain what the Global Interdependence Center is and its College of Central Bankers. So let me just go to examples. So there's negative interdependence and positive interdependence. An example of negative interdependence is the COVID epidemic, pandemic, which we're currently experiencing. There are many, many examples of positive interdependence. For example, perhaps take a jet engine that's being manufactured by GE in Scotland. It can't get that engine to the fuselage of an airplane without parts from 20 countries from around the world, and they all have to fit precisely right and be in the supply chain. And that's an example of commercial interdependence. The Global Interdependence Center has been around since 1976, promoting dialogue exactly on these types of issues and on important life issues, quality of life issues, such as food and water, in addition to financial issues, looking at financial lenses. Artificial intelligence, sovereign debt, higher education, the impact of the pandemic are all topics which we have treated in typically our pre-pandemic 15 to 20 conferences a year. The College of Central Bankers is a fairly new initiative for the Global Interdependence Center, commenced in 2018. And what it is extremely unique organization. Its fellows, currently 14 and expanding in number as we sit here today, are leaders, former leaders of central banks like Jose, like Alfonso, that have tremendous theoretical, academic, and practical experiences, but also have hands-on operational experiences in these central banks and other organizations so that they can translate theory into practice and understand the ramifications and all those elements. One of the programs of the College of Central Bankers is something called the Institutional Alignment Project, which basically tries to answer the questions, are the post-World War II institutions, which in reality govern many of the financial transactions today throughout the world, are they equipped to deal with the post-pandemic world and the artificial intelligence world, looking at lenses such as the debt, cryptocurrencies, opportunity, equality, and many others. So it is with great pleasure now that I turn to more specifically introducing our panelists. More about the Global Interdependence Center at www.interdependence.org. And the College of Central Bankers can be referenced there as well. So to introduce our guest panelists for this afternoon, as I said, both fellows of the College of Central Bankers. First, it's my pleasure to welcome Jose Di Gregorio, who is currently full professor and dean of the School of Economics and Business of the University of Chile. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a member of the board and financial advisor of several private companies and consulting organizations. He served as president of the Central Bank of Chile from 2007 to 11, and as Chile's Minister of Economy, Mining, and Energy from 2000 to 2001. Widely published, widely respected individual. Our other panelists today, and I'm most happy and delighted and honored to welcome Alfonso Prat Guy, who served as Minister of the Treasury and Finance of Argentina from 2015 to 16. Previously as a member of Congress from 2009 to 2013, and worked on projects such as increasing banking security, preventing money laundering, drug trafficking, and working on Argentina's financial system. Thank you, both of you, for being here today and for participating in this program. Next, I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council and its leader, Lauren Schwartz, for teaming with the Global Interdependence Center of the College of Central Bankers today. I will tell you, we found working with you and your staff to be absolutely flawless, and greatly appreciate the opportunity to participate with such a distinguished organization. When introducing Ms. Schwartz, I just would like to note that it's particularly gratifying to take a look at your bio and understand your deep experience as Deputy Commerce Director in International Business and Global Strategies, and your appreciation of that market. So without more ado, I'll pass the virtual microphone to Lauren. And again, thank everyone for attending and for participating today. My pleasure to greet you.
Great. Thank you, Peter, and thanks, Benjamin, for your welcoming everyone here today with us and setting the stage for this really critically important discussion about the future of Latin American economies. I'd like to add my welcome as President and CEO of the World Affairs Council and welcome our audience here today, our members of both the Council and the Global Interdependence Center, guests, teachers, and students. All of you are passionate about world affairs, and we're excited to bring this conversation with Jose and Alfonso to you today. At the World Affairs Council, we connect Philadelphia to the world and the world back to our region, and we're excited to focus on Argentina and Chile. So without further ado, let's get started with opening remarks from each of our panelists. Alfonso, can we begin with you? And then we'll turn to Jose before we jump into a moderated discussion. Alfonso? I believe, there we go. You should be good to go, Alfonso.
Okay, ready to go. Well,
yes.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to be joining this very important group of people, in particular Jose, my good friend, and all my friends there at the City of Brotherly Love, where I spent 2 years and two of the most, fruitful years of my life. I always remember that. In any event, these are opening remarks, so I'll go briefly and in a very sketchful way. I've got 4 points to make before we open up to our Q&A session. My first point is that the consequences of the COVID-19 disease on Latin America will stay on for long. The pandemic is far from over. In fact, we are leading the pack right now when you look at deaths, daily deaths per million people, even ahead of India and the rest of the regions, with no signs of abating yet. I mean, it's come off a little bit from the peak, but it's still coming in at very high levels. So it's far from over as far as we are concerned. When you look at, the economic consequences, which will, surely take a lot of our discussion today, according to IMF estimates, it will take the region at least 6 years to retake the pre-pandemic growth trend. And that trend in itself was not very impressive to start with before the COVID. And the other issue that I think needs to be taken into account, and we don't see much discussion around it, at least not at my neck of the woods, is the cost, the productivity cost of missed days at school, which according to some estimates from the OECD for countries like ours and the rest of the region will imply between 1 and 2 annual GDP in losses over the next 2 generations. And it's still counting, of course, because schools throughout the region are not completely open, as you know, and because virtual schooling is yet another way of the digital divide in a significant extent. So my first point is the consequences will stay on for long. Second point is the pandemic so far has put social unrest and political polarization merely on hold. We've seen the outcome of the Chilean elections today, and I'm sure Pepe will speak about that. But we also had Ecuador and Peru coming into a dramatic gridlock in the second round, and polarization is basically growing throughout the region. And Colombia is a good example of social tensions that were very high prior to COVID, and they were put on hold because of the lockdowns and so forth, but they haven't actually gone away. So this is one of the elements of the landscape that we need to think about when COVID is down in the past. So far, there are 30 million Latin Americans that have fallen back into the below the poverty line due to COVID and the lockdown policies. And bear in mind that even before the pandemic, Latin America had been growing below other regions at a slower pace actually than Africa for more than 25 years. So it's a combination of the two things that we need to take into account. My third point comes in the package of lessons to other regions. My third point is that context truly matters. It's not the same to lock down a population where informality is very high, such as in Latin America, where overcrowding in big cities or megalopolis is very high. Sometimes, forcing people to stay at home is probably not the best, but rather the worst solution from a health perspective. These are homes where you've got like 3 generations living inside one room. So to a largest extent, I think Latin America tried what Europe was doing, but not necessarily putting into context the Latin American context, what was being done. And the third element of the context truly matters point is that fiscal space and monetary credibility, which is closer to our departments, if you will, are critical, not just in terms of what governments can do, but also in terms of how they will be able to sustain the safety nets going forward as the economy opens up and recovers. And my fourth point then, to finish up within 5 minutes, is that so far, both regional and international cooperation has left a lot to be desired. We've done very little within and particularly across countries to help each other. And we've also gotten very little help from international organizations, development banks, regional development banks, and so forth. So I think it's pretty much up in the air, and there's a lot of work still to be done to deal with these 4 points that I've made. And I'm sure they're going to be interesting questions once Jose is over. Thank you so much for this part, Lori.
Thank you, Alfonso. In just a few minutes, you've given us quite a lot to think about. And now we're interested to hear what Jose has to say in terms of opening remarks. Jose?
Thank you very much. I want to thank for the invitation. I think that is quite interesting, always talking about Latin America. Latin America is always at the top of discussions in the agenda of international economics. There are periods of growth, optimism, and large capital inflows, so everybody wants to know more. And then there are periods of concern, turmoil, capital outflows, and crisis like now. So there is, I think, that a lot of concern about the region. Despite some heterogeneity, there are always some similarities, I think, and the region has done quite homogeneous during the crisis. So I want just to make a few points in order to go to the discussion and to try to help you to think about your main concerns. First, in terms of the economics, it's the regions with worst economic performance during the COVID crisis. It is a region that have a large decline in growth last year, and the recovery won't be complete. And in terms of growth, 2020, 2021 is the one with the most negative growth. So, and this is also happened all across the countries, except for, according to IMF forecast, Paraguay and Guatemala, the only 2 countries that will have higher output to the end of this year than they had at the beginning of the crisis. Chile will be at 0, could be even positive, and the rest all, they haven't had a complete recovery during 2021 after the COVID crisis. So I think that in terms of COVID, yeah, I think that Alfonso made the interesting point. In terms of COVID, we had a very bad performance also in the international comparison. We are like Europe, but let's say with somewhat lower growth, with somewhat more fatalities, and with the recovery more incomplete, and without the social safety net to protect people during this crisis. I think that that's at the core of what has happened. So basically, a region with a lot of health problems had a difficulties to apply efficiently contention measures for COVID because, and this was said by Alfonso, very high informality, overcrowding in some countries, especially countries with a lot housing problems, a lot of overcrowding, so it's quite difficult to contain the health crisis. Now, what's at the core? I think that is something that will be quite decisive and in the politics and the economics of next year, is that there is a high social turmoil in the region. And this social turmoil is to a large extent the result of an historical very high levels of inequality. Now, inequality is always interesting to say that in the last 20 years, inequality overall in Latin America has declined, but still remain at very high levels when you compare to other countries. So many countries have increased inequality, but they still do not reach the levels of Latin America. Latin America has reduced inequality. Many countries have reduced poverty with all this pre-COVID crisis, but now, but still very high. And then with the COVID crisis, increasing poverty, increasing inequality, and I think that this put a lot of pressures. It's quite difficult to make sound policies. We just saw in Colombia. Colombia was trying to approve a fiscal reform. Just remember, Colombia is usually fighting with the budget and indebtedness in order to not to lose investment grade, and they do continuously some taxation measures, and now trying to increase the tax burden by 3% of GDP, a large fiscal reform that was progressive. Some of the things that it contained, the package, that was the elimination of some deductions to the VAT tax, like food and public utilities, plus broadening the base of the income tax, reaching people in the middle class, caused a huge turmoil. And a turmoil that also, at the end, as we saw in October 2019 in Chile, by an increase in the metro fares, it also reveals a lot of even deeper tensions, and all of them associated to inequality and to the sense of a very divided and polarized countries, politically and economically. So what are the risks? And I think that is the main risk, even coming after the COVID crisis. I think that there are two mainly. One, if the return of the consolidation in some parts of the region of populism. Understanding by populism policies that try to address in the short term with a lot of decisions without looking forward to maintain growth at redistribution, but also without the appropriate fiscal support. So I think that this is the second part, and the second risk I would say is that we may have a serious fiscal problems down the road in Latin America because of the inabilities to do fiscal consolidation. So there are risks. This is not the same for all countries, but overall, I think that the region is going through quite a complicated phase after, not just now, but also for the period post-COVID. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jose. A lot we want to unpack in the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have question and answer time with our audience who's joined us today. I want to continue on the same theme that both of you outlined, where we know that the global GDP contracted by about 3%, but Latin America has shrank by over 7%. This region of our world is not doing as well as some other places, as many other places. And of course, there are different political ideologies that are struggling to identify the best fiscal approach to the pandemic. And like in Colombia or in Chile, we're seeing that those attempts to try and repair some of the economies and the tax policy are being met with major challenges from the electorate and from the citizens. With the benefit of 2020 behind us, which isn't to say that the year 2021 is starting off much better, but we've had a year of the pandemic behind us and the opportunity to examine different approaches around the world to the impacts of the pandemic. What do you think that governments could have done differently at the beginning of 2020 if they had known what was coming to put their economies in Latin America in a better position? Alfonso, let's start with you.
Right. Thank you, Lauren. Well, I mean, one point I've already mentioned in my opening remarks, with the benefit of hindsight, it would have been much better to have had more integration, more cooperation, both regionally, and more help from international organizations. I mean, it's a very clear tale of a developed world that had not only the resources but also the credibility to compensate for, the measures that were restricting production across the board. That was not the case in our region, and I think both our governments and the international organizations that deal with the region could have done more. That's one point. Second point is that with more than a year under the belt, we can very easily claim that lockdowns alone prove insufficient. It's not just, lock down your economy and sit on your hands. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And in particular, I think, I speak more about my country than the region as a whole, but I think in general, there's been very little testing and tracing throughout the first lockdowns. And now there's been less vaccinating than would be advisable. So the two things that proved very efficient elsewhere, testing, tracing, and isolating in the uptrend of the crisis, and vaccinating in the downtrend, we didn't do enough. And despite the fact that we had a 6-month window, because we're in the southern hemisphere, to basically copy the things that were working properly in the northern hemisphere. I think closing schools will end up being a lot more costly and less effective to stop the virus than the alternatives. And I think the consequence of that is, just as Jose was mentioning, we'll start seeing dropout rates in school picking up, and that's something we need to work on like right now, because otherwise the consequences of that, both in terms of production but also in terms of economic inequality, will keep growing and will be a problem. And finally, I think the example of Argentina, where we had the longest and most stringent lockdown, and it proved socially and economically very costly. I mean, Lauren, you were mentioning the average recession in Latin America was around 7%. It was 10% in the case of Argentina. Only Peru was worse than Argentina in the region. And I think only Peru and the UK were worse than Argentina in the whole world. So no doubt that lockdown was very, very costly from a social and from an economic point of view. And there's no evidence that the results were very, very different from a fatality point of view compared to countries that took a different route. So I think what we've learned is that you don't just jump into whatever comes to mind because you've got the pressure of the public opinion to do something. I think you need to think it through more next time, and I think governments in general need to be multi-dimensional. I would argue it's not enough to gather around the specialists in epidemics. I think you need to take into account the voices and the opinions of other experts in psychology, in sociology, in economics, and in many other areas where I think most countries in our region have just stuck to one dimension of the problem, where the problem is truly multidimensional.
Yeah, let me just make a couple of points. Some of them will be, of course, based more on what I have seen in Chile. So it's quite difficult to generalize. There is one thing that Latin America is quite polarized, and it reminds me a bit the approach in a much poorer setting of the US, a very polarized discussion and proposals of measures in the health side and also in the economy. So the COVID crisis became a political crisis, and governments were not able to basically call for some basic agreements through all the political spectrum in order to come out from this crisis together. Like happened, I would say more in Europe. Of course, the US was quite polarized too, but and for the region, it's quite bad. It's quite bad because it's a region characterized by high political polarization. You know, there was president that had to leave, and we have a lot of turmoil. The second thing is the lack of having a clear view of what to do. And the impression that I have, for example, from the Chilean case, is that most of the measures, many of them very well applied, they were sort of behind of the curve. So after 2 months or 3 months of lockdown, the government, which is a quite solvent government and can incur in large government expenditure, they had to pass like 2-3 months in order for the government to start giving relevant transfers to people that was in lockdown, which is the basics. If you want to have a successful lockdown, you have to feed people that can work. And it took time. And so taking time and going behind of the curve in the health area and in the policy area, basically what's happened is that the political discussion leads you to do much more, sometimes very inefficiently done, because you have tried to compensate for your delay. And despite that, Chile is a country that has been quite successful in vaccination. However, we still don't see numbers to come down. We are closer to the peaks in terms of infection, with death quite low. So we have very high number of cases, reported cases, but the death has been much lower. But I think that is the containment and the policies is not what matters in period quite critical like this. It's not just matter of the right policies, but also the right time. And I think that this is what has happened in the region overall in general, and also the lack of building some sort of consensus to not make the fight against the COVID a national priority rather than a political fight.
A lot to think about, and unfortunately, with the numbers the way they are, there will be more chances, right, for the world and for countries to try again as we see more spikes and go into different seasons. I know we're all hoping the lessons learned get applied, but time will tell. There have been a lot of challenges to actually make these things happen. Let's take a turn towards central bankers and your areas of expertise, although you're quite well versed in lots of areas of governing and politics, and we're happy to have that perspective today. And we saw many central banks through Latin America ease monetary policy, providing liquidity to the financial system, of course, and cutting policy rates to record lows. Let's talk about how this has impacted the region, and specifically how it will continue to impact policymaking in the future. And Jose, let's start with you and acknowledge that Chile, because of its unique moment in time where it's preparing to rewrite its constitution, and the very recent elections shifted the power in a way that people perhaps didn't expect. There's a lot of question around what the opportunity will be to make different financial policies, what will be viable and what is needed. I'll ask the question to both of you, but start with Jose first.
Yeah, let me just first say that central banks in the region and in emerging markets in general, they have cut rates. They have cut rates less than during the global financial crisis because they start with lower rates. So the monetary policy space has been lower now, but there has been very relevant cuts, some countries doing some form of unconventional monetary policy. In my view, something that we still are looking at developments, but has been quite important in the case of Chile and many other countries with the central banks, is supporting credit. So this is a new policy. Many times came together with the governments. Most governments in emerging markets, they provide some form of credit guarantees to SMEs and to medium-sized firms. Why? Because of the nature of this crisis, in which you basically stop producing for a while, and when you resume, there will be a lot of debt. And if you don't allow for credit to flow, you may have a lot of inefficient foreclosure. And what we saw with the crisis was that there was at the beginning an expansion in credit compared to previous crises, where usually credit collapses. And this was a combination of fiscal policy, central banks doing special and target policies in order to foster credit to the non-financial corporate sector. In the case of Chile, there was a line, a liquidity line at the central bank that you can also you would also use it if you lend that money to the non-financial corporate sector. And I think that this was a good thing across the region. We have avoided, and I think that in the world, unnecessary or excessive foreclosures. So I think that this is good. Now, what can be done? And I think that we enter in things that I am still trying to understand is what the future of Chile. And after the very unexpected results of last night's elections, I just say, as in financial market, you always say that it's unexpected because the market expectations and the surveys and everything were saying things completely different. I have to now. I don't think there is a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of uncertainty on how will be written this constitution. There is even uncertainty that people that do not like independent central banks. But I think that at the end, the discussion and with this very broad constitutional assembly, I don't think that there will be changes in areas that need to be done in the social and some economic things. But in terms of the ability of the central bank to do policy, I think that I don't think that could be undermined. We still are I think that the big change, if you want to know, there are two changes with the Chilean elections last night. First, things moved to left. So the right-wing parties from the government, they obtained like 20% of the assembly, 20 something they said. But they didn't reach a third necessary to have some veto power. Now, this is basically unexpected in a country that normally has at least 1/3 of people right-wing. I think that this is the result of an historically unpopular government that even, so this was a vote against the government and was also a vote against the elite. Many people, even leaders, important leaders from the left, from the right, center, everywhere, they lost against young people, not well known, but they did a lot of grassroots works. For example, in the coalition of the government, many people lost, but we saw also the loss of the president on the left, of the president of the Teachers Association, that has been quite keen on closing schools, by the way, of the president of the main Workers Association, so in the left. So this was a movement against the elite, and surprisingly, there were like, I don't know, 15%, roughly a number, I don't, but like 20 members chosen from independent list. The surveys from the previous night said that at most it would be elected in the 158 members, one independent, and there are more than 20 independent. So people independent to new people. So that's also creates some form of uncertainty because you don't know the history. But I think that I'm not pessimistic. I am cautious, but not pessimistic about what's happening. And this, of course, the main implication, and this is where there is a lot of uncertainty, is what will happen with Congress, because the Constitutional Assembly will have more than a year to discuss, and then there will be a vote if people like the Constitution. No, but late this year we have a new Congress, and with the with the collapse of the right wing of the people close to the government, I would say there is a lot of uncertainty about the outcome.
Oh, thank you, Jose. A tremendous amount to watch in Chile, and it's all connected, and you're part of the world. Alfonso, in neighboring Argentina, you're no stranger to complex fiscal policy decisions and managing markets. We'd love to hear your perspective. And I think you're on mute right now.
Yeah, first on Chile, if I may, it looks like for good or for worse, Chile is finally becoming more similar to its neighbors. So we'll see what that means going forward. But the challenges are all over the place, and of course Argentina is also facing its own challenges. To a large extent, I would argue that we are pretty much on a league of our own. Sadly enough, alongside maybe with Venezuela, Argentina is a country in the region that has more work ahead to be done in a number of areas and in a number of dimensions. The situation is extremely weak right now in Argentina. Poverty rates are close to 45% of GDP, close to a historical record in a society that doesn't take inequality as easily as some other countries in the region may take it. Just to give you an example, you were asking about, or Jose was explaining about central bank policy throughout the crisis. Argentina is now running with food prices running at around 70% per annum, 7-0 per annum. Inflation is stuck around between 3.5% and 4% per month over the last 4 or 5 months. To some extent, that's because the way in which the central bank dealt with the safety nets that were offered last year, with no credit to the treasury. The onus of that financing came to the central bank, and that meant not merely quantitative easing, but basically money printing. And a part of that is now, rippling through the system and creating price pressure pretty much everywhere else. The central bank also has some issues of limited availability of reserves. And we also have very important midterm congressional elections coming due later this year. So it's truly a tough environment, however you want to look at it, and even for our Argentinian standards. I think the way of looking how we get out of this is, as with many other countries, investment. The question you've got to ask yourself is, where and when is investment going to come through? Not just foreign investment, but in particular, domestic and local investment. To give you a sense here, we're running at an output gap of around 16%. That means that the economy should be more than 20% bigger than what it is right now, and it's not. And of course, part of that is COVID, but maybe a bigger part of that is lack of investment throughout the last few years. Right now, investment over GDP is at 16%. That's a very low figure. It's even below our historical average, which is low to start with, 18 and a half. So we need to find a way of push that investment figure above, say, 22% of GDP before we can even think about closing the GDP gap and closing, the inequality gap. And even if we did that, it would take still quite a few years to close that gap. The problem is that when you look at what the government has been doing so far, nothing in their war chest is actually incentivizing investments, but quite the opposite, through the tax system, through the regulatory system, and so forth. So right now, the sense that you get when you do business in Argentina, or when you took when you talk to business people in Argentina is that the future is absent. It's all about, present, surviving at the present level, and not just, of course, for companies, but also for households. And the past is always readily debatable in Argentina. We continue to do that, but the main problem is that as long as there's no future in the discussion, there's no vision in the political arena, this creates significant frustration to the young and to the small entrepreneurs that look around and probably ask themselves whether they should be moving elsewhere to do their own thing. And we saw that happening 10 years ago in Venezuela. Hopefully this is not the same route that Argentina is going to, but essentially there are elements in your radar screen that tells you that if things don't change significantly and rather quickly, then this trend will become more and more difficult to sail through.
The future is absent in Argentina. That's a dramatic statement, but I can understand why you're putting it like that, right? And how does that inspire or not young people to finish school, like we've talked about, to invest in jobs or for foreign direct investment to come to your country? It's a weighty topic. We've got just a few minutes left and a few audience questions coming in. I'll point a question to each of you to see how many we can get through. Paul Horn asks us, he says, there would seem to be two sources of substantial outside help for Latin American countries in difficulty. One are the international institutions like IMF, World Bank, IFC, and the second source is the US in Paul's question. He asks, do the international institutions have enough financial resources to truly make a difference? And what could or should the US be doing in Latin America to make a positive impact? Jose?
Yeah, I think that the problem is that Latin America is large enough and rich enough to not to be able to, or for it not to be enough to have the rapid finance initiative and all of that oriented to more to poorer countries. So Latin America is always in the problem that it needs much more than what the fund can help. Now, the main problem today, rather than, and also the traditional IMF lending, which is for balance of payment support, it will be needed in order for debt to be able to be rolled over. Still, there is not a big debt problem, except for some countries that is pre-COVID crisis, like Argentina or like Venezuela, of course. But the issue is whether there will be a need for some funding for fiscal support in the future. And I think that's not clear. There are not enough instruments. Perhaps the US could do something, but I think that politically it's quite difficult. And the IMF is difficult. I just want to point out one thing that could be good for Latin America from the international economy. And is that we may face a period of very good commodity prices. And that can help, public finance and can help the economy in these very rough times.
I'll be glad when these mute buttons are a thing of the past. Alfonso, do you have any comments or reaction to Jose's thoughts?
I mean, first, on the US side of the equation, I think the one area where the US can help right now and can help a lot is offering the excess vaccines that they have secured themselves prior to the big jab procedure that they've gone through. Basically, we can use that help throughout the region, and we should use it as soon as possible, as vaccines are coming in slower than most governments were expecting. And I think there's an element of the Biden administration who are basically looking into the sooner the better. That would be my thought. On the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the IDB and CAF and all the regional banks, my point is that there's a lot of idle lending capacity, and you wonder if that lending capacity is idle when you most need it. Surely you're not doing the right thing, you know. And again, the inequality compared to the rich nations or to the developed nations that can, you know, with a click of a finger, you know, put to work trillions of dollars. We don't have the luxury to do that. But then again, I would have thought that if there was a time where you could use the international institutions to basically replace for that, and to avoid the response to the crisis being as unequal as it has been so far, this would have been a time. The IMF's got around 1.5 trillion sitting in their coffers. They're doing a little bit of that right now with the capital and the quota increase, but it's not nearly enough of what needs to be done. And I think, just as Jose was saying, Bretton Woods was about you know, the balance of payments, but this is a lot more important than the balance of payments. So I think it's about time for the minds behind these institutions to open up their hands and to be more proactive, because at the end of the day, you know, the chain is as strong as its weakest link, and until every single human being is vaccinated, and until every single country in the world is safely protected from this particular virus, no one will be out of risk, no matter where they live. So I think it's a human problem, and in as much as it's a human problem, we should use the human institutions at hand the most we can, because this is the most challenging crisis for the world we've had in many generations, probably since the Second World War.
Indeed, right. And it's shown us that we have to work together as a world and be interconnected and be neighbors to find the solutions, while at the same time closing our borders and stopping the movement of goods sometimes, and people as well. It's a very, it's hard to wrap our minds around it, but we must work together to get to the other side. I'll ask one question for a quick answer from each of you, and then we'll wrap up our hour together. Something hopefully with a bit of a positive spin. Maria Dreyfus asks, is there anything positive that the region will learn from the pandemic? Has it become a catalyst for something like use of technology? I'll add, in a way that's equitable and accessible. Are there silver linings for Latin America in the pandemic that will help it overcome some of the challenges that your region has been facing? Jose?
That's a very difficult question, but because I think that there is a lot of learning around the world of the COVID crisis, and in how we treat ourselves in the need for insurance, many things. So the issue would be, is there something special for Latin America and that can make Latin America do particularly well? It's difficult. It doesn't come anything to my mind rapidly. I think that if there is an issue that has been at the core of all the turmoil in the region, is the issues of inequality that are being taken much more seriously in some countries. I think that in Chile, in my view, in Argentina, maybe the other way around, because we're much closer to populism and with increasing in inequality and poverty, trying to fight inequality. So I think that's quite mixed what's going on in the region, with a lot of also political realignment that we don't know exactly what this will do. But we may have overall a very bad next years for the region.
Political realignment and inequality, we can relate to a bit of that here in the United States, although from a different perspective.
That's something that's around the world. Yeah, you're right.
Right. Well, right, and there are trends that are happening, but how they play out and what the solutions are to this rising inequality and political realignment and surprise election outcomes doesn't always make us feel better right now, regardless of your political view. There's just so much change happening on top of the pandemic. And there are many more questions than answers. And in a country, as Alfonso says, that is uncertain of its future, layering all that together is part of what we wanted to understand more here today. But I'd like to ask Alfonso, do you see something positive coming out of the pandemic as a guiding light or a lesson learned that you would like to share with our audience today?
Well, I think it was mentioned by whoever asked the question. Technology. I mean, technology is. I think it's a big opportunity for Latin America, and it's maybe the only opportunity of leapfrogging. And there's a lot leapfrogging that we could use to catch up. And when you look around the region, there are a number of Latin American unicorns who were doing very well before the pandemic and who are now doing extremely well. And also technology can sometimes be a great equalizer, just as sometimes it can be a great unequalizer depending on the policies. But the potential is there, and I'm glad that technology was mentioned in the question. I think also we come out of this crisis with more consciousness about our beloved Earth. So the environment is going to be an element of our future discussions going forward, I think pretty much throughout the region. And the obvious point of health as well. You know, health systems will take a larger share of the national budgets going forward, and that will create some sort of discussion and some challenge as well. And but probably the second silver lining is that we've learned, depending on the country, but we've learned largely the hard way, thanks to this pandemic, that we cannot save ourselves alone, and that the cost of political polarization is basically unbearable. I mean, we can't quite possibly afford to stay on complete opposite, packs staring at each other, because the starting point is very challenging, and because the situation going forward is very challenging. So you were mentioning the US. I think there's an element of that going on in the US. I also believe that voters are getting bored about polarization, and they will start demanding for something new. Maybe the electoral outcome in Chile this weekend has something to do with that, with the traditional parties being hollowed out by the independents. Of course, we need to look at these trends with a lot of caution, because they can end up being disruptive. But I think chances are that they are the new normal going forward, not just in terms of the economy and in terms of technology, but also in terms of politics. We need a politics of more dialogue, of more consensus, of more working alongside and together. And I believe going forward, the countries that will emerge better placed after this crisis will be the ones that have the logistics to vaccinate as quickly as possible, not just for this variant, but for the upcoming variants as well. And also the countries that are better at finding consensus around the main challenges going forward. I think that would be the way of framing your countries into the future. And this, of course, creates a significant challenge for the authorities and for every single, party member, and for every member of the political elite, as Jose was mentioning before.
Thank you. Vaccines, technology, consensus, monetary policy. We do have some tools in the toolbox, but as you all have heard today, the solutions and the path around it are not yet clear. We are at time, so we'll have to wrap up our discussion today. And I want to personally thank our panelists, Alfonso and Jose, on behalf of the World Affairs Council, and the Global Interdependence Center. And thank you to all of our members and guests who joined us today. Of course, we couldn't do it without Benjamin Leavenworth, our honorary consul of Chile in Philadelphia, and our series partner, the Chilean American Chamber of Commerce, and our generous sponsors. We encourage you all to join us for our other upcoming programs focusing on Chile and our Beyond the Border series taking place all year. We have a couple of tickets for a little bit of a lighter topic, a Chilean wine tasting happening this Thursday night. The tasting is virtual, but the wine is real. It'll be delivered to your own home in the Philadelphia region. And we have upcoming programs on Chile's contributions to the future of food technology and innovation. So stay tuned for more coverage on Latin America, as well as many other world affairs topics. Thanks again to Jose and Alfonso, our expert panelists today, for your perspective and deep experience in giving us some insight into your part of the world. We appreciate your time and we look forward to a brighter future for Latin America and our neighbors around the world. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.